Everyone in the ballroom laughed at the poor black woman near the entrance, until the Korean Mafia Boss saw what she was holding in her hands. The Imperial Crown Hotel shimmered above Manhattan like a palace built for people who had forgotten what ordinary life looked like. Crystal chandeliers scattered gold across the marble floors while a string quartet played softly beneath the sound of champagne glasses touching in celebration. Politicians, CEOs, socialites, and men whose wealth moved through shadows filled the grand ballroom in tailored tuxedos and diamond-covered gowns worth more than most Americans made in a year. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. The engagement gala for Daniel Kong, heir to the Kong Syndicate, had drawn the most powerful people on the East Coast. Every detail had been polished to perfection, from the imported white roses lining the staircase to the 6-foot ice sculpture carved with the Kong family crest. And then the woman appeared. Ruth Carter stood near the entrance clutching a worn cardboard box against her chest, her faded gray coat hanging loosely over tired shoulders. Her shoes were damp from the freezing rain outside, and silver strands curled through her dark hair beneath the weak hotel lights. She looked completely out of place among the glittering crowd, like someone who had wandered into the wrong world by mistake. The younger guests noticed her first. A few exchanged uncomfortable glances. One woman whispered behind her champagne glass. Another covered a laugh with perfectly manicured fingers. Near the doorway, 2 security guards blocked Ruth's path before she could step farther into the ballroom. "Ma'am, this is a private event," one guard said quietly, already reaching toward her elbow. Ruth nodded softly. "I understand, honey. I just need to return something to Mrs. Kong." The second guard frowned at the old box in her hands. "You can leave it with the front desk." Ruth tightened her grip slightly. "No," she whispered. "It needs to go directly to her." Across the room, Olivia Sinclair noticed the scene unfolding near the entrance. Daniel Kang's fiancée stood draped in silver silk beneath the chandeliers, flawless and cold, the kind of beauty that made magazines and destroyed confidence at the same time. She tilted her head toward her friends and smirked. "Unbelievable," she murmured. "Who let a homeless woman into my engagement party?" A few people laughed under their breath. Someone muttered something about hotel security standards. Another guest wrinkled his nose as Ruth stepped carefully onto the polished marble floor, clearly aware that every eye in the room was following her now. Ruth lowered her gaze, embarrassed but composed, carrying herself with a quiet dignity that somehow made the mockery feel even crueler. She looked like someone used to surviving humiliation without complaint. Then something unexpected happened. Evelyn Kong, elegant in a black velvet gown near the center table, suddenly froze the moment she saw Ruth's face. The older woman's champagne glass trembled in her hand. Color drained slowly from her expression. "No," she whispered under her breath. Before anyone could react, Evelyn stood from her chair and crossed the ballroom herself. The music continued softly, but conversations began dying one by one as guests noticed the mother of Daniel Kong walking directly toward the poor black woman everyone else had been laughing at. Ruth looked startled as Evelyn stopped in front of her. For a moment neither woman spoke. Then Evelyn's eyes drifted downward toward the cardboard box in Ruth's trembling hands. And suddenly, the powerful woman looked like she might cry. The ballroom remained frozen as Evelyn Kong stared at the old cardboard box in Ruth Carter's hands like she had just seen a ghost walk through the doors of the Imperial Crown Hotel. Around them, the wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably beneath the golden chandelier light, confused by the sudden silence spreading through the room. Ruth lowered her eyes again, clearly regretting coming here at all. "I am sorry," she said softly. "I did not mean to interrupt your party. I only wanted to return this." Her voice carried the warmth of someone who had spent a lifetime speaking gently because the world had rarely spoken gently back. Evelyn reached forward slowly, her elegant fingers trembling as she touched the edge of the weathered box. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Ruth swallowed hard before answering. "I kept it all these years. I thought maybe your family deserved to have it back." Olivia Sinclair crossed her arms beside the champagne tower, visibly irritated that attention had shifted away from her engagement celebration. Mrs. Kong, she interrupted with a tight smile, perhaps this is not the best time for, whatever this is. Evelyn did not even look at her. Her eyes stayed locked on Ruth's face. Open it, she said quietly. Ruth hesitated for a second before carefully lifting the lid. Inside rested several old objects wrapped in tissue paper yellowed with age. A tiny pair of knitted children's gloves. A faded subway pass from Chicago dated 15 years earlier. And beneath them all sat a small Polaroid photograph curled at the corners from time. Evelyn gasped softly the moment she saw it. The color drained from her face completely now. Nearby guests leaned closer, curiosity replacing mockery as whispers spread through the ballroom. What is it? Someone murmured near the bar. Olivia stepped forward impatiently and glanced inside the box herself. Seriously? She scoffed under her breath. Old junk? Ruth immediately began closing the lid again, embarrassed. I should go, she said quietly. I knew this was a mistake. But before she could turn away, Evelyn suddenly reached out and grabbed her hand with surprising strength. No, the single word stopped the entire room. Ruth looked startled. So did the security guard standing nearby. Evelyn Kong was known across New York as a woman of impossible composure, someone who never showed emotion in public no matter how powerful the people around her were. Yet now her eyes glistened beneath the ballroom lights as she held onto the hand of a poor black woman everyone else had been mocking moments earlier. Where did you find this photograph? Evelyn asked again, her voice shaking. Ruth looked down at the Polaroid still resting inside the box. A boy gave it to me years ago, she answered softly. He was freezing. Hungry too. The ballroom grew quieter with every word. Even the quartet musicians slowed uncertainly as nearby conversations disappeared entirely. I never knew his last name, Ruth continued. Only that his name was Daniel. Olivia laughed once in disbelief. This cannot be serious. But Evelyn's face broke completely then. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. Across the ballroom, the massive double doors suddenly opened. Every head turned instantly. Daniel Kong had arrived. Dressed in a black tailored suit with silver cufflinks catching the chandelier light, he entered surrounded by silence and power so heavy it seemed to bend the atmosphere around him. Men twice his age lowered their eyes when he walked past. Politicians straightened their posture. Security shifted automatically into formation. But Daniel barely noticed any of them. Because the moment his eyes landed on the old photograph inside Ruth Carter's trembling hands, he stopped walking. The ballroom seemed to stop breathing the moment Daniel Kong froze near the entrance. The soft violin music faded into uneasy silence as hundreds of eyes shifted between the powerful man standing beneath the chandeliers and the poor black woman holding an old photograph beside his mother. Daniel did not move at first. His dark eyes stayed locked on the faded Polaroid inside Ruth Carter's trembling hands, and for the first time that night, the calm authority that usually surrounded him cracked ever so slightly. Olivia Sinclair noticed it immediately. Daniel? She asked carefully, forcing a laugh that sounded thinner than before. What is going on? He did not answer her. Slowly, almost cautiously, Daniel stepped closer through the ballroom crowd. The polished marble reflected the glow of crystal light beneath his shoes while guests instinctively moved aside to clear a path for him. Ruth looked overwhelmed now, clutching the cardboard box tighter against her chest as if preparing to apologize again for simply existing in the wrong place. Sir, one security guard began quietly, we can remove her if you would like. Daniel's head turned sharply toward the man. Do not touch her. The words were not loud, but the entire room heard them. Silence deepened instantly. Olivia blinked in confusion. Several executives exchanged nervous glances. Nobody had ever heard Daniel Kong speak with emotion in public before. He stopped only a few feet away from Ruth now. Up close, she could see the exhaustion beneath his composed expression, the faint tension in his jaw, the way his breathing had subtly changed since seeing the photograph. Daniel looked down at the old Polaroid again. In the picture, a young boy wrapped in an oversized winter coat stood beside a smiling black woman near a subway platform dusted with snow. The boy could not have been older than 10. His face was thinner than frightened too. "Where did you get this?" Daniel asked quietly. Ruth swallowed hard. "You gave it to me," she answered. The ballroom erupted into whispers. Olivia stared at Ruth in disbelief before laughing under her breath. "This is ridiculous." But Daniel barely seemed to hear her. His eyes never left Ruth's face. "That is impossible," Olivia continued, stepping forward beside him. "Daniel, this woman is obviously confused. She probably saw your mother entering the hotel and made up some story hoping for money." Ruth immediately lowered her eyes. "I do not want money," she said softly. "I only came to return what belonged to him." Olivia smiled coldly. "Of course." Evelyn Kong suddenly turned toward Olivia with visible anger in her expression. "Enough." The older woman's voice cut sharply through the ballroom. Olivia fell silent, stunned. Evelyn rarely raised her voice. Daniel slowly reached into the box himself now. His fingers trembled slightly as he picked up the tiny pair of knitted gloves resting beneath the photograph. Gray wool. Faded blue stitching near the fingertips. Worn from age but carefully preserved. The second his hands touched them, something inside him visibly shifted. His face drained of color completely. A memory had returned. Not clearly. Not fully. But enough. Snow falling beneath flickering subway lights. Cold wind cutting through thin clothes. A woman's voice telling him to keep the gloves because winter nights in Chicago could kill children who had nowhere to sleep. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Around him, the ballroom waited in complete silence. Even Olivia no longer spoke. Ruth looked at him carefully now, studying his face beneath the golden light. Then, very softly, almost like she was afraid of the answer, she asked, "Daniel, do you remember the Red Line station on 47th Street? The moment those words left her mouth, Daniel's composure shattered. The silence inside the ballroom became almost unbearable after Ruth spoke the name of the subway station. Daniel Kong stood motionless beneath the chandeliers, the old gray gloves still clutched tightly in his hands while memories he had buried for years began pushing violently back to the surface. The polished marble floors. The freezing Chicago wind slipping through underground tunnels. The smell of wet concrete and burnt coffee drifting through the station late at night. And a woman's voice telling a frightened little boy that he was going to survive. Daniel's breathing slowed unevenly. "No," he whispered under his breath, though it sounded less like denial and more like disbelief. Ruth studied him carefully now, her tired eyes softening with recognition. "You used to sit near the vending machines because the heaters worked better there," she said gently. "You never talked much those first few nights." Daniel stared at her as the ballroom disappeared around him piece by piece. He could suddenly remember the oversized coat hanging from her shoulders. The tiny paper cups of soup she somehow always found. The way she hummed old gospel songs whenever the station got too loud at night. 15 years vanished in seconds. Olivia stepped closer, visibly uncomfortable with the emotional shift taking over the room. "Daniel," she interrupted carefully, "you do not seriously believe this woman." He ignored her completely. "How long did you keep this box?" he asked Ruth quietly. Ruth glanced down at the worn cardboard edges. "Since the day you disappeared." Evelyn Kong covered her mouth as another tear slipped down her cheek. Around them, wealthy guests stood frozen beneath the golden ballroom lights, no longer whispering with amusement but staring with growing unease. The poor black woman they had mocked only minutes earlier now held the attention of the most feared man in the room. Ruth gave a faint smile, though sadness lingered behind it. "You were just a boy," she said softly. "Cold all the time. Always pretending you were not scared." Daniel looked away briefly, jaw tightening. Across the ballroom, members of his security team exchanged confused glances. None of them had ever seen their boss look vulnerable before. To them, Daniel Kong was control itself. A man who never hesitated. Never shook. Never let emotion enter the room before him. Yet now his hands trembled around a pair of old children's gloves. "I searched for you," Evelyn suddenly whispered. Daniel turned toward his mother slowly. "4 months after we adopted you," she continued, voice breaking. "You kept talking about a woman from the station. But you were traumatized. Sick. The police could not find anyone." Ruth lowered her eyes. "I left Chicago shortly after that winter," she admitted quietly. "Life moved around a lot after that." Olivia folded her arms tighter now, frustration beginning to overpower her patience. "This entire situation is becoming extremely inappropriate," she said sharply. "Daniel, there are senators here. Investors. Reporters." For the first time, Daniel looked directly at her. The coldness in his eyes silenced her instantly. "Inappropriate?" he repeated quietly. Olivia hesitated. The room held its breath. Daniel slowly stepped closer to Ruth again. "Do you remember the snowstorm?" he asked. Ruth nodded faintly. 3 nights before Christmas." His expression tightened even more. Another memory surfaced. Him shivering uncontrollably beneath flickering station lights while Ruth wrapped her own scarf around his neck even though her hands were already numb from cold. He had forgotten so much over the years. Or maybe he had forced himself to forget because surviving had demanded it. But now every detail returned with painful clarity. Daniel looked down at the gloves again before speaking in a voice barely above a whisper. "You gave me these because my fingers were turning blue." Ruth smiled sadly. "You cried because they were too big." A few nervous laughs escaped from guests nearby before immediately dying in. The heavy silence. Daniel did not laugh. He looked at Ruth like a man staring directly at the person who had carried him through the darkest chapter of his life. And suddenly, for the first time all night, shame began creeping across the faces of the people standing around them. The atmosphere inside the Imperial Crown Hotel had changed completely now. Only 20 minutes earlier, the ballroom had been overflowing with laughter, champagne, and the careless confidence of people who believed wealth placed them above everyone else. But now those same guests stood frozen beneath the chandeliers, watching Daniel Kong stare at Ruth Carter as though the entire foundation of his world had suddenly shifted beneath his feet. Nobody touched their drinks anymore. Nobody smiled. Even the string quartet had stopped playing. The silence itself felt expensive. Ruth stood quietly near the center of the ballroom, visibly uncomfortable with the attention surrounding her. She still held herself with the same calm dignity she had carried through the doors with, despite the judgment she had endured since arriving. Her coat remained damp from the cold rain outside, tiny drops of water still clinging to the fabric beneath the golden lights. Daniel noticed it now. And somehow that small detail affected him more than anything else. Because 15 years ago, she had been cold too. He remembered it clearly now. The subway station had smelled like snow, rust, and burnt coffee. He had been 10 years old, hungry, terrified, and alone after losing everything in a single week. Chicago winter had wrapped itself around the city like punishment, and Daniel had spent nights pretending he was not freezing because admitting fear had once felt more dangerous than the cold itself. But Ruth had seen through him immediately. "You always acted tough," she said softly now, almost smiling through the emotion in her eyes. "Even when your teeth were chattering." A few guests exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel Kong, the feared businessman whose name carried whispers across New York, had once been a homeless child sleeping inside train stations. The realization unsettled the room in ways nobody expected. Daniel looked down at the gloves again. "You gave me food every night," he said quietly. Ruth shook her head gently. "Not every night. Some nights I could not afford enough for both of us." The confession hit the ballroom harder than shouting ever could. Several women lowered their eyes immediately. A senator standing near the back cleared his throat awkwardly. Olivia's expression hardened further with discomfort. She hated where the attention was going now. hated that the center of her engagement gala had become a poor woman in a faded gray coat. Daniel, she interrupted carefully, forcing composure back into her voice, I understand this story is emotional, but perhaps this conversation would be better handled privately. Daniel slowly turned toward her. Privately, he repeated. Olivia nodded quickly. There are important people here tonight. For a second, nobody moved. Then Daniel glanced around the ballroom itself. Crystal chandeliers. Diamond necklaces. Men discussing billion-dollar deals beside imported wine. People who had laughed at Ruth before knowing who she was. Before knowing what she had done. His jaw tightened subtly. Important? He asked quietly. Olivia hesitated again. Evelyn Kong closed her eyes briefly, already sensing the shift happening inside her son. Ruth immediately noticed it too. Please, she whispered softly. I never came here to embarrass anybody. Daniel looked back at her, and something in his expression finally softened beneath the weight of memory. Embarrass? He said. Miss Carter, you are the only person in this room who has nothing to be embarrassed about. The words landed like thunder in complete silence. Nobody spoke afterward. Nobody even seemed to breathe. Daniel then did something that shocked the ballroom even more. He removed his tailored black suit jacket without hesitation and stepped forward, carefully placing it over Ruth's shoulders to shield her from the cold rain still clinging to her clothes. The gesture itself was simple. Quiet. Respectful. But inside a room built entirely around status and appearances, it felt almost revolutionary. And suddenly the people who had mocked Ruth Carter minutes earlier could no longer look her in the eye. The silence lingering through the ballroom no longer felt awkward now. It felt heavy. Transformative. Like every person standing beneath the crystal chandeliers had suddenly become aware of something ugly inside themselves they could no longer ignore. Ruth Carter stood wrapped in Daniel Kang's suit jacket, visibly overwhelmed by the sudden shift in the room around her. Only minutes earlier, security had been prepared to escort her outside into the cold rain while guests whispered insults behind champagne glasses. Now the same people avoided looking directly at her at all. Daniel remained beside her, his expression unreadable beneath the warm ballroom lighting. But those closest to him could sense the storm moving quietly behind his eyes. Memories kept surfacing faster now. Ruth sitting beside him on a freezing subway bench. Ruth splitting a stale sandwich in half because he had not eaten in 2 days. Ruth pretending not to notice when he cried silently at night because he missed his parents. I thought you were gone forever, Daniel admitted softly. Ruth gave a small shrug beneath the expensive jacket draped over her shoulders. People like me disappear all the time, she answered gently. The honesty of the statement seemed to strike the room harder than any accusation could have. Evelyn Kong lowered her gaze, visibly emotional. Across the ballroom, several guests shifted uncomfortably near the bar while pretending to focus on their drinks. Nobody knew where to place their eyes anymore. Olivia Sinclair, however, looked increasingly irritated with every passing second. She stepped closer to Daniel again, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. Daniel, she said carefully, forcing calm into her voice, the board members from Seoul are arriving soon. We really need to continue the evening. Daniel did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on Ruth. Olivia's smile tightened. This entire situation is becoming a distraction. Ruth immediately stepped backward. She is right, she whispered softly. I should leave now. She started reaching for the old cardboard box again, clearly trying to escape before causing more trouble. But Daniel moved first. No, his voice was calm this time. Quiet. Absolute. Ruth looked up at him uncertainly. Daniel slowly turned toward the ballroom staff standing near the entrance. Bring another chair, he said. Several people blinked in confusion. Sir, one waiter asked carefully. Daniel's gaze sharpened slightly. Miss Carter will be sitting with my family tonight. The words sent another ripple through the room. Olivia stared at him in disbelief. At the family table? She asked before she could stop herself. Daniel looked directly at her. Yes. The simplicity of the answer somehow made it even more powerful. One of the older businessmen near the stage shifted nervously. Another guest quietly set down his wine glass. The social hierarchy of the evening had just been shattered in front of everyone. Ruth looked horrified by the attention. "Oh no," she whispered quickly. "Please do not do that. I do not belong at those tables." Daniel's expression softened slightly. "You belonged there long before any of us did." The room went completely silent again. Evelyn Kong closed her eyes briefly as emotion washed over her face. For years she had watched her adopted son build himself into a man feared by politicians, respected by billionaires, and whispered about across entire cities. But in this moment, standing beside the woman who once protected him as a starving child, Daniel suddenly looked less like a mafia heir and more like the frightened little boy Ruth had once wrapped in a scarf beneath subway lights. Ruth shook her head slowly, still overwhelmed. "Daniel," she whispered, "I am not dressed for places like this." Daniel glanced around the glittering ballroom filled with diamonds, silk gowns, and million-dollar smiles that suddenly looked strangely hollow beneath the lights. Then he looked back at Ruth. "Neither are most people in this room," he said quietly. And somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against the marble floor. The sound of shattered glass still echoed faintly across the ballroom floor as a young waiter hurried nervously to clean the spilled champagne near the back wall. Nobody returned to their conversations afterward. Nobody even pretended anymore. Every eye remained fixed on Daniel Kong standing beside Ruth Carter beneath the warm chandelier light, his black suit jacket resting over her shoulders like a silent declaration the room still struggled to understand. Ruth looked deeply uncomfortable with the attention now surrounding her. Her fingers tightened around the worn cardboard box while the enormous ballroom suddenly felt far too bright, far too expensive, far too full of people staring at her like she had somehow become the center of a story they no longer controlled. A waiter carefully placed another chair beside the Kong family table exactly as Daniel ordered. The soft scrape of wood against marble sounded strangely loud in the silence. Olivia Sinclair watched it happen with disbelief slowly turning into humiliation. "Daniel," she said quietly through clenched composure, "this is supposed to be our engagement celebration." Daniel looked at her calmly. "And?" The single word landed harder than anger would have. Olivia blinked. "And this woman is a stranger." Ruth immediately shook her head. "Please," she whispered softly. "Do not argue because of me." But Daniel's expression changed slightly at the word stranger. "She is not a stranger," he said. "She fed me when nobody else cared whether I ate." The room went still again. Somewhere near the orchestra platform, an older woman lowered her eyes in visible shame. Daniel slowly pulled out the chair beside his mother himself before turning back toward Ruth. "Sit with us," he said quietly. Ruth hesitated so long it almost hurt to watch. She looked down at the polished marble beneath her worn shoes as though afraid she might stain the floor simply by standing there too long. "I cannot," she admitted softly. "People like me do not belong at tables like these." Evelyn Kong reached forward gently and took Ruth's hand. "Then perhaps tables like these need better people sitting at them." The words spread through the ballroom like a wave. Several guests looked visibly uncomfortable now. Earlier that evening they had laughed at Ruth without hesitation. Mocked her coat. Judged her appearance. Assumed her value within seconds. But now the woman they dismissed was being welcomed personally by the most powerful family in the room while they themselves stood silently watching their own behavior exposed beneath crystal lights. Ruth slowly sat down beside Evelyn at last, though her movements remained cautious, almost apologetic. Daniel stayed standing beside her for a moment longer. He could still remember that winter with painful clarity now. The freezing subway station. The hunger. The loneliness. And Ruth somehow making impossible nights survivable with almost nothing herself. "You used to tell me stories," he said quietly. Ruth smiled faintly. You could never sleep during storms. Daniel almost smiled back. You told terrible stories. A few soft laughs escaped nearby guests before fading quickly again. The atmosphere had shifted into something emotional now. Human. Real. Olivia, however, stood completely alone beside the champagne tower. The carefully planned perfection of her evening had cracked beyond repair, and she could feel it happening in real time. She looked around the ballroom for support, but nobody rushed to her defense anymore. Nobody wanted to be associated with the cruelty they had all participated in only minutes earlier. Daniel finally sat beside Ruth at the family table. The symbolism of the moment was impossible to ignore. A poor black woman once treated like an intruder was now seated beside New York royalty while senators, investors, and celebrities watched in silence from a distance. Then Ruth carefully opened the cardboard box again and removed one final item hidden beneath the photograph and gloves. It was an old folded letter, worn soft with age. The moment Daniel saw his own childhood handwriting on the envelope, his face changed completely. Daniel stared at the old envelope in Ruth Carter's hands as though time itself had folded open in front of him. The childish handwriting across the front was shaky but unmistakably his. The paper had yellowed with age, softened by years of careful handling, the edges worn from being opened and closed too many times to count. Around the ballroom, nobody spoke. The entire room seemed suspended beneath the crystal chandeliers while Daniel slowly reached for the letter with unsteady fingers. Ruth hesitated before letting go of it. I kept meaning to throw it away, she admitted softly. But I never could. Daniel carefully unfolded the paper. The moment his eyes scanned the first line, his entire expression changed. 15 years disappeared from his face again. The letter was written in uneven block handwriting from a frightened 10-year-old boy trying desperately to sound brave. Dear Miss Ruth. Thank you for feeding me. Thank you for the gloves and the soup and for sitting awake when I had bad dreams. I know I cry sometimes when I sleep and I am sorry. The ballroom remained perfectly silent except for the faint sound of rain tapping against the tall hotel windows high above Manhattan. Daniel swallowed hard before continuing silently through the letter. I think a family is coming to take me somewhere safe. The social worker says I might get a new home. I wanted to say goodbye but you were sleeping and you looked tired. I did not want to wake you up. His hand tightened slightly around the paper. Ruth lowered her eyes quietly beside him. You told me once that cold weather does not last forever. I did not believe you then. But maybe you were right. If I ever become somebody important one day, I will come back and help you too. I promise. Daniel stopped reading. His jaw tightened sharply as emotion flickered across his face before he could hide it. Across the ballroom, several guests visibly looked away now, uncomfortable witnessing something so painfully human inside a room built almost entirely around image and power. Evelyn Kong quietly wiped tears from her eyes beside Ruth. Olivia stood frozen near the champagne tower, no longer angry now but increasingly isolated from the emotional gravity swallowing the room around her. Daniel slowly lowered the letter. I never came back, he whispered. Ruth immediately shook her head. You were a child. I forgot you. The honesty in his voice hit harder than any speech ever could. Ruth looked at him gently. No, she answered softly. You survived. Daniel looked away briefly. Toward the rain-covered windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. For years he had built his life around control, ambition, and survival. Every weakness had been buried beneath discipline. Every painful memory locked away behind success. But now a single worn letter had ripped through walls he spent half his life constructing. Do you know what I remember most? Ruth asked quietly. Daniel turned back toward her. She smiled faintly through tired eyes. You always thanked people. Even when you had nothing. The room grew heavier somehow after that. Because everyone standing there understood exactly what she meant. The frightened little boy Ruth remembered had carried more kindness in his empty pockets than many of the wealthy adults now surrounding them beneath diamonds and imported silk. Daniel looked down at the letter again. The final line sat near the bottom in crooked handwriting. I hope one day somebody is kind to you the same way you were kind to me. His breathing caught slightly at the words. Then, very slowly, Daniel folded the letter with extraordinary care before looking directly at Ruth again. Where have you been living all these years? He asked quietly. Ruth hesitated before answering. Mostly shelters, she admitted gently. Sometimes church housing when there was space. The confession moved through the ballroom like cold wind. Daniel closed his eyes for one brief second. Because while he had been building empires, attending private schools, and dining beside world leaders, the woman who once saved him had been struggling simply to survive. The rain outside the Imperial Crown Hotel grew heavier against the tall windows overlooking Manhattan, but inside the ballroom nobody moved. Nobody reached for another drink. Nobody returned to business conversations or political smiles. The entire room remained trapped inside the quiet weight of Ruth Carter's confession. Mostly shelters. Sometimes church housing when there was space. Daniel Kong sat motionless beside her, the old childhood letter still resting in his hand like evidence of a promise he had failed to keep. For years he had convinced himself that survival justified everything. That becoming powerful somehow honored the suffering he endured as a child. But now, sitting beside the woman who once protected him when he had nothing, all that success suddenly felt strangely hollow. Ruth noticed the guilt building in his expression immediately. Do not do that to yourself, she said softly. Daniel looked at her. Do what? Carry blame for surviving. Her voice remained calm, warm, almost maternal despite everything life had taken from her. You were a little boy, Daniel. But that only seemed to make the shame worse. Because the frightened little boy Ruth remembered had grown into one of the wealthiest men in New York while she spent winters moving between shelters trying to stay warm. Across the ballroom, several guests could no longer hide their discomfort. A woman wearing diamonds worth more than most homes quietly wiped tears from her eyes. One older businessman loosened his tie and stared silently at the marble floor. Even the hotel staff seemed emotionally shaken now. Earlier that evening they had looked at Ruth with polite suspicion. Now many of them looked at her with something closer to heartbreak. Olivia Sinclair stood completely isolated near the champagne tower, arms folded tightly across her chest. She hated how the room had turned against her without anyone openly saying it. Hated how every cruel glance thrown at Ruth earlier now seemed to reflect back onto everyone who participated in it. This is becoming ridiculous, Olivia finally said, breaking the silence sharply. Her voice echoed harder than she intended inside the ballroom. Daniel slowly turned toward her. Olivia straightened her posture beneath the chandelier light. I understand she helped you once, she continued carefully, but this emotional spectacle is not appropriate for an event like tonight. Nobody reacted. Nobody defended her. The room simply waited. Daniel stared at her for several long seconds. Then his gaze drifted slowly across the ballroom itself. Crystal chandeliers. Imported flowers. Tables covered in gold linen and expensive wine. Powerful people who spent their lives measuring human value by status, appearance, and influence. And sitting quietly beside him was the woman who once gave half her food to a starving child while having almost nothing herself. Daniel suddenly stood from his chair. The movement alone made the room tense instantly. Olivia looked relieved at first, thinking perhaps the evening was finally returning to normal. Then Daniel reached slowly toward his left hand and removed his engagement ring. The tiny sound of metal touching crystal echoed loudly as he placed the ring beside his untouched champagne glass. Olivia's face went pale immediately. Daniel, she whispered. He looked at her calmly now. Not angry. Not cruel. Just deeply disappointed. You called the woman who saved my life a distraction. The silence after those words felt enormous. Olivia opened her mouth but nothing came out. Daniel glanced toward Ruth briefly before looking back at the ballroom. Tonight showed me something important, he said quietly. Not about her. His eyes settled on Olivia again. About us. Nobody breathed. Nobody moved. Somewhere near the back wall, one of the waiters quietly lowered his head. Evelyn Kong closed her eyes as emotion crossed her face again. Ruth looked devastated by what was happening, already shaking her head softly. "Please," she whispered. "I never wanted this." But Daniel was no longer listening to the expectations of the room around him. For the first time in years, he seemed to care only about truth. And beneath the golden ballroom lights, surrounded by wealth and power, that truth suddenly became impossible for anyone there to ignore. The ballroom remained silent long after Daniel Kong removed the engagement ring from his finger. The small circle of platinum rested beside his untouched champagne glass like the final piece of a life he no longer recognized. Olivia Sinclair stood frozen near the table, her face pale beneath the chandelier light as reality slowly settled around her. For years she had known Daniel as a man impossible to shake. Calm. Disciplined. Ruthless when necessary. But tonight, one poor woman carrying an old cardboard box had undone everything the room thought it understood about him. Ruth looked devastated by the tension unfolding around her. "Please," she whispered. Again softly, "you should not throw your future away because of me." Daniel turned toward her immediately. "You are not the reason this happened." His voice carried no anger. Only clarity. And somehow that made the moment feel even heavier. Evelyn Kong slowly stood from her chair beside Ruth. The older woman glanced across the ballroom filled with wealthy guests pretending not to stare directly at them anymore. "There is something all of you should know," she said quietly. Every eye lifted toward her at once. Daniel looked at his mother with faint surprise. Evelyn rarely spoke publicly about the years before adopting him. Those memories had always lived behind closed doors, protected by silence and grief. But tonight, something inside her had changed too. Evelyn looked down at Ruth with visible emotion. "The social worker who brought Daniel to us told me he survived one of the coldest winters Chicago had seen in years." Her voice trembled slightly. "They said a homeless woman kept him alive inside the subway tunnels after he became separated from his family." Several guests lowered their eyes immediately. Ruth looked uncomfortable hearing herself discussed like this in front of strangers. "When we found Daniel," Evelyn continued softly, "he would barely speak. But every night before falling asleep, he asked the same question." Daniel's jaw tightened. Evelyn looked directly at him now. "He kept asking whether the woman from the station had found somewhere warm to sleep." The silence deepened painfully across the ballroom. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Because he remembered that now too. The fear of leaving Ruth behind. The guilt of being taken somewhere safe while she remained out in the cold. "I searched for her," Evelyn admitted quietly. 4 months. Ruth blinked in surprise. "You did?" Evelyn nodded slowly. "But there were no records. No permanent address. No family contacts. Just a first name and subway cameras that had already erased the footage." Daniel looked toward Ruth again, his expression filled with something dangerously close to regret. "All these years," he whispered. Ruth gently touched his arm before he could finish. "Listen to me carefully," she said softly. "I never wanted you carrying guilt." Her tired eyes met his steadily beneath the chandelier light. "You were the best thing that happened to me during those years too." Daniel looked stunned by the words. Ruth smiled faintly. "Most people walked past me like I was invisible. But you always looked at me like I mattered." Several people in the ballroom visibly wiped tears from their eyes now. Because that simple truth exposed something painfully human inside the room. The woman everyone dismissed tonight had once been treated with more dignity by a frightened homeless child than by wealthy adults surrounded by luxury. Olivia stood completely alone now, her silence heavier than any argument she could have made. Daniel slowly looked around the ballroom again. At the senators. Investors. Celebrities. Men who built companies. Women who hosted charity galas. People who donated millions to causes while mocking a poor woman at the door without hesitation. His expression hardened quietly. "You know what frightens me most?" he asked softly. Nobody answered. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the room. "That if she walked into this ballroom tonight without me recognizing her," his voice nearly broke for the first time all evening, "I might have become exactly like all of you." The words hit the room like cold rain. And suddenly the silence no longer belonged to Ruth Carter. It belonged to everyone who failed her. The silence after Daniel Kang's words lingered through the ballroom like smoke no one could escape. Crystal chandeliers still glowed above the guests, the string quartet remained frozen near the stage, and rain continued sliding slowly down the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. But the atmosphere inside the Imperial Crown Hotel no longer resembled a celebration. It felt more like judgment. Daniel stood motionless near the family table, his gaze sweeping slowly across the crowd around him. Senators who once demanded his attention now avoided eye contact. Executives who built fortunes speaking about leadership suddenly looked uncertain beneath the weight of their own behavior. And seated quietly beside Evelyn Kong was Ruth Carter, wrapped in a borrowed suit jacket, still carrying herself with more grace than anyone else in the room. Olivia Sinclair finally broke the silence again, though her voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier that evening. "Daniel," she said carefully, "you are humiliating me in front of everyone." Daniel turned toward her slowly. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Not with anger. Not even with cruelty. Just with the calm realization of someone seeing another person clearly for the first time. "No," he answered quietly. "Tonight revealed who we already were." Olivia's face tightened instantly. "That is unfair." Daniel glanced briefly toward Ruth. Was what happened to her fair? Nobody moved. Olivia opened her mouth but found no answer waiting there. Because everyone in the ballroom remembered exactly how the evening began. The whispers. The laughter. The assumptions made within seconds of seeing a poor black woman standing near the door. Daniel stepped away from the table slowly now, his polished shoes crossing the marble floor with measured calm. Every eye followed him automatically. "Do you know what troubles me most?" he asked quietly, addressing the room itself rather than any one person. Nobody here questioned whether Miss Carter was kind. Or honest. Or decent. His gaze drifted toward the crowd. "You judged her worth the moment you saw her coat." Several guests lowered their eyes immediately. One woman near the back visibly wiped tears from her cheeks. Daniel stopped beside the shattered remains of the champagne glass still scattered near the ballroom wall. Tiny crystals reflected the chandelier light across the marble floor like fragments of broken pride. "You saw poverty," Daniel continued softly. "And decided it meant she deserved less respect." His words were not loud, but the room absorbed every syllable with painful clarity. Ruth looked overwhelmed hearing herself defended like this. "Please," she whispered quietly from the table, "you do not owe me this." Daniel turned toward her immediately. "Yes," he said. "I do." The honesty in his voice struck harder than anything else that night. Evelyn Kong watched her son with tears in her eyes again. Because for years she feared the world Daniel built around himself had slowly buried the compassionate child she first adopted. But tonight that boy had returned. Older. Wounded. Powerful beyond imagination. But still capable of recognizing humanity when it stood quietly in front of him. Olivia folded her arms tightly, struggling to hold on to what remained of her composure. "You are throwing everything away for someone you have not seen in 15 years. Daniel looked at her calmly. "No," he answered. "I almost threw everything away by forgetting her." The ballroom fell silent again. Even Olivia had no response left now. Daniel slowly walked back toward the family table before stopping beside Ruth once more. Then, in front of senators, billionaires, celebrities, and cameras quietly recording from across the room, Daniel Kong did something nobody there would ever forget. He lowered himself onto one knee beside Ruth Carter's chair. Gasps rippled through the ballroom instantly. Ruth looked horrified by the attention, shaking her head softly. But Daniel stayed there anyway, looking up at the woman who once protected a frightened little boy inside a freezing subway station. "You kept me alive," he said quietly. "And tonight this room finally understands what kind of person that makes you." Somewhere near the orchestra stage, one of the musicians quietly began to cry. The ballroom stood completely still as Daniel Kong remained kneeling beside Ruth Carter's chair beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers. Nobody in the room could remember the last time they had witnessed genuine humility from someone with that much power. The senators near the back wall looked stunned. Investors who once competed desperately for Daniel's approval now stood speechless with lowered eyes. Even the hotel staff had stopped pretending to work, their attention fixed entirely on the quiet scene unfolding near the family table. Ruth looked overwhelmed beyond words. Tears gathered slowly in her tired eyes as she stared down at the man kneeling beside her. "Please stand up," she whispered softly. "You should not bow to someone like me." Daniel shook his head gently. "Someone like you," he repeated quietly. His voice carried through the ballroom with painful clarity. "Miss Carter, when the world ignored me, you did not." Ruth lowered her gaze immediately, struggling to contain emotion she clearly was not used to showing publicly. Daniel slowly rose back to his feet beside her chair, but the atmosphere in the room had already changed forever. The social order that existed at the beginning of the evening no longer made sense to anyone standing there. Wealth suddenly looked smaller. Status looked fragile. And the woman once mocked near the entrance somehow carried more dignity than all the diamonds in the ballroom combined. Evelyn Kong reached for Ruth's hand again, holding it gently between both of hers. "Do you know what Daniel used to do after we adopted him?" she asked softly. Ruth looked surprised. Evelyn smiled sadly through tears. "Every winter, he left extra blankets near subway stations." Daniel looked away immediately, embarrassed by the memory. "Mother," Evelyn ignored him gently. "He said maybe the woman who saved him might find one someday." Ruth covered her mouth as emotion finally overwhelmed her completely. A quiet sob escaped before she could stop it. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just the sound of someone who had spent too many years surviving without ever expecting kindness in return. Several guests in the ballroom quietly wiped tears from their own eyes now. Because everyone understood what they were truly witnessing. Not charity. Not pity. Recognition. Daniel looked at Ruth with visible regret still lingering behind his calm expression. "You should never have struggled alone all these years," he said quietly. Ruth shook her head immediately. "Daniel, listen to me." Her voice trembled slightly now. "You already gave me something nobody else ever did." He frowned softly. "What?" Ruth smiled through tears. "You remembered me." The room went silent again. Because deep down, everyone there understood how rare that kind of gratitude truly was. Most people forgot the hands that helped them survive once success arrived. Most people buried uncomfortable memories beneath luxury and ambition. But tonight, in front of the entire city's elite, Daniel Kong had chosen to remember. Olivia Sinclair stood near the ballroom wall now, completely disconnected from the room around her. The engagement ring still rested untouched beside the champagne glass where Daniel left it earlier, gleaming faintly beneath the chandelier light like a symbol of a life that no longer fit him. Daniel slowly turned toward the orchestra platform then. "Play something warm," he said quietly. The musicians looked startled before the pianist nodded softly and began playing a gentle melody that drifted through the ballroom like healing itself. Daniel looked back at Ruth. "You once told me cold weather does not last forever." Ruth laughed softly through tears. "You remembered that too?" Daniel finally smiled for the first time all evening. It was not the controlled smile of a businessman or the polished expression cameras usually captured at public events. It looked younger somehow. Lighter. Like the frightened little boy from the subway station had briefly returned beneath the expensive suit and years of armor. Then Daniel carefully pulled out the chair beside him at the family table and looked directly at Ruth once more. "Come have dinner with your family," he said quietly. And this time, when Ruth Carter looked around the ballroom, nobody there dared make her feel unwelcome again. The music drifting through the ballroom softened the atmosphere in ways nobody expected. What began as a glamorous engagement gala had transformed into something far more human beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Imperial Crown Hotel. Conversations no longer revolved around politics, investments, or influence. Tonight, the room had been forced to confront something wealth could never purchase. Dignity. Ruth Carter sat quietly beside Evelyn Kong at the family table, still wrapped in Daniel's black suit jacket. The warmth of the fabric seemed almost unreal to her, like she was afraid the evening might disappear if she moved too quickly. Waiters who had once looked uncertain near her now approached with genuine kindness, carefully placing warm food and tea before her with respectful smiles. No one mocked her anymore. No one whispered. Daniel remained seated beside Ruth throughout the dinner, listening more than speaking. For the first time in years, he looked strangely at peace. Not because power surrounded him. Not because important people filled the room. But because a missing piece of his life had finally returned. At one point, Ruth glanced around the ballroom in disbelief. I still cannot believe all this, she admitted softly. Daniel looked at her calmly. Neither can I. Evelyn smiled gently beside them. Maybe some nights are meant to change people. Across the ballroom, guests slowly began approaching Ruth one by one. Quiet apologies replaced earlier judgment. A senator shook her hand respectfully. One woman tearfully admitted she should have spoken up sooner. Even members of the hotel staff stopped by simply to ask whether she needed anything warm for the ride home later that evening. Ruth accepted every gesture with quiet grace, never bitter, never cruel. And somehow that humility affected the room more deeply than anger ever could have. Olivia Sinclair eventually left the ballroom without another word. No dramatic scene. No shouting. Just the quiet realization that some people lose power the moment compassion enters the room. Daniel watched her leave only briefly before turning back toward Ruth. Because for the first time all night, he understood what truly mattered. Hours later, the gala finally began winding down. Rain still shimmered outside against the Manhattan streets, but the storm had softened now. Guests slowly gathered their coats and disappeared into elevators, leaving behind empty champagne glasses and fading music beneath the chandeliers. Daniel stood near the entrance beside Ruth and Evelyn as the final cars arrived outside. Ruth looked down at the old cardboard box still resting carefully in her hands. I almost threw this away last winter, she admitted quietly. Daniel smiled faintly. I am glad you did not. Ruth looked at him with tears gathering again in her eyes. You became a good man, Daniel. He shook his head softly. Not yet. Then, after a brief silence, he added quietly, but maybe tonight I remembered how to become one again. Ruth smiled through tears. Evelyn reached over and gently wrapped her arm around Ruth's shoulders as the three of them stood together beneath the golden hotel lights. Not as strangers. Not as charity. But as family connected by one act of kindness from long ago. Outside, Manhattan traffic moved through the wet streets while reporters and drivers waited beyond the glass doors, unaware that the most important thing that happened inside the Imperial Crown Hotel tonight had nothing to do with wealth or power at all. It was the moment an entire room watched dignity walk in wearing a worn gray coat and finally recognized its value. And that night, beneath crystal chandeliers and the fading sound of piano music, the most powerful man in the room remembered what humanity looked like. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who still believes kindness matters.